Welcome to the Space for It with Makayla and Jacob. We are two therapists working to navigate making space for what comes up as part of the human experience. And today, we are going to do part two of talking about sex in therapy. In the last episode we talked a lot about some of the discomfort that comes up in talking about sex in therapy, or really just in life in general, as well as some of the feelings that exist around the taboos and shame and just different parts of how, as much as sex is a very important part of our functioning as humans, often it becomes this part that we can't really talk about. We don't really feel like we're free to explore or have conversations around.
Yeah.
And today we're going to get, I would say, a little bit more into some of the specifics, and also maybe try and look into a few ways that you can personally work to become more comfortable with it and maybe have some benefit there.
Yeah. To be able to maybe put some labels or names to your experiences and use that for your benefit.
One of the reasons that sex becomes this really uncomfortable topic is that because we don't talk about it, we don't realize how normative many of the experiences are. And the more we talk about it, the more we're actually able to realize, like, oh, that thing that I feel like I'm the only one who experiences, that thing that I feel shame about, that's actually really common, and it's not something that needs to be so isolating or shameful.
One of the things we're going to get into is arousal non-concordance, which is, I think, really matches with what you were just saying. But before we do that, we were just talking about the parts of the body and naming those and being accurate in that. And I thought it was kind of fascinating because myself, I just turned 31. Some of these are pretty new, which you can say what you want, think what you want about that. But even I was surprised at not knowing or not having learned some of this before pretty recently, like within the last year. So
I'm actually really curious, put you on the spot,
Yeah.
give you a chance to be
Okay.
vulnerable.
Love that.
When you were growing up, did anyone ever sit down with you and be like, hey, these are the specific names of parts of your genitalia?
I do not remember that happening. No. I remember like a general understanding in health class, maybe. Like at some point they came in and were like, here's some deodorant, like as kids are starting to go through puberty, and here's like a general overview of your body, but very general, not specific. I remember being invited to say the words vagina and penis so that we were more comfortable with them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's kind of all of what I remember about that.
I think that's a pretty common experience. Like that aligns pretty accurately with what I experienced as well. And also there's this added element of when we don't talk about something, like when we look at it, like if we talk about female genitalia in particular, if we call all of female genitalia a vagina, that's both kind of actually inaccurate because the vagina is the internal part, but also we're creating, or what often seems like it happens is we create this idea that it's like, oh, well, that's that part of the body that we don't talk about. Or that's the part of the body that we're uncomfortable talking about. And you can tell, like when you try and get people to have a conversation about it, they will avoid saying names or labels. And maybe part of that is just not feeling confident about what the names or labels would be. But I think part of it is this internalized shame that comes from it not being something that was ever openly talked about.
Yeah, a little bit of both in there, because it can be uncomfortable to say something that you're not certain of, for sure, and not wanting to get it wrong. I noticed that was part of my experience. And then also, yeah, just like talking about it when it's not something that doesn't feel like it's an open topic, doesn't have a lot of space for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it kind of just shuts down any conversations that could be really valuable to talk about what's going on down there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is this sensation or this body reaction or anything that shows up?
It's really actually, it's sad how, in addition to creating shame, that also makes it so that, like, if a kid is being sexually abused, there's stats about this that I cannot remember off the top of my head, But the likelihood of them being sexually abused, particularly by someone they know, goes way down if they actually know all of the anatomical names for their body parts.
Fascinating.
And people are more likely to believe them if they're like, hey, somebody touched my vulva, than if they're like, hey, somebody wanted to touch my no-no zone or something. Where it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? Or sometimes even like if someone is grooming a child, they'll talk about it like a cookie or something else, where it's like they'll use a word that's totally different. But if a child actually knows, like, hey, these are the parts of my body, then they know that it's like, no, it's not a cookie. We don't talk about it like that.
Yeah, that's honestly where I kind of became more aware of the actual verbiage and language to put to these different parts. Is one of my friends had their first kid. My best friend had her first kid a couple years ago, and as they were teaching their young little girl like the names of their body parts, I was like, I haven't heard that term before, or I've heard it, but I'm not exactly sure what that is. Like, I wouldn't be able to teach her that until now. Now I could probably teach someone that.
I have 4 kids, and with the 2 of them that are old enough to talk, like we talk about genitalia. It's a very open conversation in our household because we want them to know. We want them to use the correct terms, and we don't want them to grow up having any internalized shame about any part of their body.
Just so fair. It's another part of our body. Like, why does it get such a bad rap? We want health all over. It's all connected.
The way that our bodies get talked about influences how we feel about them. And one of the reasons it's so valuable to actually talk about them in a way that positively impacts that is that our bodies also function in ways that don't always make sense. Cue the conversation about arousal non-concordance. Would you like to tell us what that is? Because I think that's a great example of this.
Yes. Question. Before we do that, should we give an overview outline of what we're talking about? Like actual words to put to different parts of the female reproductive system. I think the male reproductive system is mostly known.
Actually,
what's your experience there?
Here's my take. Okay. I think that for the sake of furthering the conversation, in this exact context, talking about female genitalia matters more. Because as much as I would argue people maybe know more terms about the penis, there are a lot of people, like I myself have not known the names of many parts of my own genitalia until the last few years when I've been learning more about all this, and I've been like, oh, this is interesting, let's start learning more. I would argue that probably we're not alone in that experience, but also so much of science and medicine and the conversation around all this is very sexist, and it's sexist in favor of male genitalia in general. So I would say, for the sake of this conversation, we don't need to go there. It has already had so much time in the spotlight.
Okay.
So
let's spotlight on female
yes.
sexual organs and genitalia.
In the book, Come As You Are, one of the exercises that Emily Nagoski talks about is if you have female genitalia, get a mirror or get a partner and get comfortable, sit down, and take a good look. And she talks through, in general, what you'll see. And know that for everyone, what you see is going to look a little bit different. Like we have a lot of ideas in our mind of what these things should look like based on pictures that we see, like porn that we see. We have all of these ideas of what it should look like, many of which are actually fairly doctored, as in they're not actually what it looks like. They're overly perfected images. So it's important to know that what you see on yourself is beautiful and perfect as it is, even if it doesn't look like something that's not real.
One of the main phrases she says is all the same parts organized in different ways.
Yes.
So very much all the same parts, just will look a little different for every single person.
Both of us have a picture of it up right now.
Okay, so like I was saying, when my best friend was teaching her little daughter, one of the words that came up initially that I didn't quite recognize was the vulva. The vulva is the part that contains all the external genitalia. Contained in that are all these different parts. So the part that has hair on it, or that would have hair if you didn't shave or wax or things like that, is called your mons pubis. Totally natural to have hair there. It's okay. It depends on preference between you and your partner, and there's definitely cultural pieces to that. Anyway, going down farther into it, those outer lips that also have hair on them are your labia majora.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of a fatty tissue, a little bit thicker, again, would generally have hair on them. And then you go inner lips, which are your labia minora. Those are the thinner ones, won't have hair, maybe different in color or texture to the outer ones. I'm using this symbol if you're looking on video, kind of the shape, general shape of the vulva. Mm-hmm. At the top of where your mons pubis and your labia majora and minora kind of come together is kind of the point of the triangle. The top of the triangle mm-hmm. would be where your clitoris is, generally speaking. So again, all the same parts organized in different ways. Yours might be a little bit here or there, but that'll be the general area that it'll be. Inside the labia minora will be your vaginal opening. And so that's where, as well as your just above that will be your urethra. So mm-hmm. where pee comes out, very different from where a penis would go in, or a finger, or where your menstrual cycle would come out. So that's the vaginal opening. Mm-hmm. The actual, like, within the body, that canal is your vagina.
What's wild about that is that so often it's all just referred to as the vagina.
Yeah.
And that was literally the last thing that you got to, because that's the part that's on the inside. Like, the part that we all actually see is the outside. Like, that's the part that you interact with more of the time, other than when you're having actual, like, penetrative intercourse.
Which is fascinating.
It is.
Because, yeah, we do refer to it in that different way. I also, fascinating to me, learned reading, what was it? Principles of Pleasure, or maybe I was watching it on Netflix, that the clitoris is not just right in that top little spot.
Oh, no, it's huge.
But it's like almost a butterfly looking thing that mm-hmm. kind of wraps around the vagina internally. Mm-hmm. And so that's where a lot of people can can have orgasm from intercourse, because of how that is stimulated within mm-hmm. the vagina. Yeah.
The amount of nerve endings that exist there that can be engaged with to create sensations of pleasure is just astounding. Mm-hmm. And yet, because if we go back to, like, because the sexist nature of medicine and all of this exists, so much of the conversation for years has been, well, you need to get pleasure purely from penetrative sex. Mm-hmm. And we should ignore everything else. It's just there as tertiary or extra. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you that needs a medical diagnosis and treatment. Mm-hmm. It's a big part of why there's so much shame around it. There's so much negativity around it, because there hasn't been a lot of conversation around, like, no, these are what the parts are. These are what they do. And they're there for a reason.
And again, with all the same parts being organized in different ways, not everyone is going to have the ability necessarily to have orgasm via penetration, or via penetration alone, or not with every partner. The way that those two different parts come together, that looks different.
Part of why it's really valuable to understand the physical component of genitalia is that, in addition to just existing, they also function. Like, we have our nerve endings there, but also both male and female genitalia are self-lubricating. And that, well, in addition, they're not just self-lubricating. Both male and female also harden when they get aroused. It just looks different. But there's a key thing there that is a major contributor to shame. And it's that there's this thing called arousal non-concordance. That means your body and your brain both can get aroused. And sometimes they are aroused by the same thing at the same time. And sometimes they are not. Sometimes one is and the other is not. And when that happens, whether it's that like your body becomes aroused and therefore it's hard and self-lubricating, but your brain is like, no, this is not arousing to me and should not be arousing to me. Or the inverse happens where it's like, I feel like I should be physically turned on because I'm emotionally and mentally turned on, but my body doesn't feel ready. Like when either of those things happen, that's called arousal non-concordance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those experiences are really good at getting us to question and judge ourselves.
I want to slightly say too, when you said get hard,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking the process that's happening is blood rushing to those organs and
Mm-hmm.
them swelling. So we use the term getting hard. We also often use that as a sign of like arousal
Mm-hmm.
or desire, and those two things are different.
It's funny. I should know this off the top of my head because I literally just reread the book a week ago. Let's see if I can get it. Arousal is, in my mind, arousal is a physical state. Arousal is when our body, when the blood is rushing there, when there is the physical change that represents, like in our minds at least, this means I'm turned on. That's arousal. But desire is more about pleasure. It's more about, I'm actually interested in this. I actually like this. I'm actually pursuing this, or I'm enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
And when those two things align, when desire and arousal align, it makes room or gives us the opportunity to have incredible experiences. And when they don't, again, it's confusing.
One of the things I absolutely love that Emily Nagoski talks about, and the way she says it, is like our bodies recognize things that are sex related,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be what that arousal response is in our bodies. So it's like you could see nearly anything. And if our body or if our mind designates that as being sex related, then it's going to most likely have that response and kind of start the process. A big part of that is when we are aroused, when we have lubrication and things like that, we are less likely to have pain or tearing or different things like that. So it's the body getting ready for sexual acts. Yet that is a very different state than our mind being turned on, desiring a sexual act with someone or something, or that, and wanting that thing. So she talks about it as restaurants. So when you're walking down the street, you can recognize like, oh, there's a restaurant. Maybe it's Thai food and you are really not into Thai food. So it's not a restaurant you want to eat at, but it's a restaurant. Like you could eat there if you wanted to. So it's sex related, but it's not something you desire or want.
One of the reasons this matters so much and acknowledging it matters so much is because of the sheer amount of time that what we desire and what arouses us doesn't actually align. And this is also generally different based on gender. So for males, in general, there's a 50% overlap. So it's like 50% of the time that my body is aroused, my brain is also into what's going on. And then the other 50%, it's not, whether it's my brain is like, I'm aroused, but my body's not, or vice versa. But for females, that number is closer to 10%, as in 10% of the time there's an overlap, and then the other 90% there's not. And what's crazy is that they've done all these studies that, again, were referenced in the book, where they would show women various like videos or pictures of things, from waterfalls to animals to all of these things, where it's like most people would probably not inherently look at that and be like, that's the restaurant that serves food. They'd look at that and be like, that is what is, okay, cool, nature shop. And yet when they would measure the body's physical arousal, there were a lot of those things that created physical arousal when there was no desire at all. That's such an important thing to know about, because again, there's all of this judgment that exists when it's like, well, your body isn't doing what it's supposed to. Or when your body might be aroused by something, but your brain is not. And then somebody comes to you and is like, wow, you're really aroused right now. Like, you're really wet. You must really be loving this. When your brain is like, no. And then that creates this question where it's like, well, which one of these two sources of information is right and which is wrong? Is my brain wrong that I'm not enjoying this and that I actually am? Or is my body wrong that it's getting aroused when it shouldn't be?
Well, and part of what you're saying too, there's a difference. There are different types of arousal, or desire, different types of desire. One is spontaneous, which is more associated with males who just like have a thought, the feeling's there, ready to go. And then there's responsive, which is more associated with females, where it's like, okay, I'm comfy in bed, my partner starts touching my arm and their skin feels nice, and now my body is starting to respond or think about sex or be into it. This is why this is really important to talk about too, is because that sometimes can get that idea of responsive desire can be misinterpreted through a lens of like rape culture, which was a new term for me until I read this book. But it made a lot of sense as she explains it, where it's like, if I just start doing things to my partner, this person, then they will want it. So what Emily Nagoski comes back to and actually changed in her book, the term originally, or the saying was arousal first, then desire. She changed it to be pleasure first, then desire, because that is very different, pleasure and arousal.
One of the things that's really interesting is that, again, going back to the sexist nature of all this, if you think about it from the male perspective of, well, if I can just get your body turned on, then you're turned on, and then I get to have sex with you, that doesn't give any regard for how you feel. Like, there's no regard for, what can I do to make your life better? What can I do to actually to provide you with space where pleasure is actually an option? Because one of the things that heavily impacts our interest for sex is what's going on in our lives. And again, there's always been this narrative, or maybe not always, as far as I know, most of the time there's been this narrative where it's like, we should just be able to do this whenever we want to do it or whenever we need to do it, with no regard for like, what's stressing you out in your life right now? Like, how often are the kids grabbing you right now? Like, what are all of the other factors in your life that are contributing to how you're feeling? And how does that contribute to your interest level here, or even your body's ability in this moment to become aroused? And I love that idea of, let's focus on pleasure first, because that's about creating not just this experience, but also the environment. Like, let's not just think about how I can get sex. Let's think about how I can give you the space to experience pleasure. Let's talk about how I can maybe take on some of the burdens of stress, or support you in actually eliminating some of them, which is a very different, like that's an entirely different perspective on all this than I think was kind of the general norm for so many years.
And even opening in that, being able to create a context, like you say, for pleasure, but there's more of a conversation about what things for you are pleasurable. Like what, and I think through my experience, that's not something that I had thought about much, been asked about much, or things that way, or even known about. And where my mind goes with that is when we talked in our previous episode about accelerator and brakes. We talked about that, right?
I think we talked about it briefly, but if you want, I think you should.
Brief. Yeah, brief.
Tell us about it.
I didn't realize when it comes to arousal, she likes to use this metaphor of there's an accelerator and there are brakes. And sometimes it's about okay, what hits our accelerator? But a lot of times too, especially for us with more responsive desire, it's about how do we let off the brakes. So like you were talking about, how can I offload some stress, or be able to relax, or things like that, things that hit your brakes. How can we remove those? And a lot of times our accelerator is probably fine. Maybe we need to tweak it, and it's great to know more about yourself and like what hits your accelerator. But I found that really interesting, of like, even if your accelerator is going in your car, your brakes are a stronger system. Like your brakes in general are that more survival system of fear, anxiety, which are things meant to be like, we need to survive. And so while it's very important, again, to know what hits your accelerator, also really important to know what hits your brakes, and then how to handle that, and how to be able to, as she says, turn off the offs.
That's huge, because again, it's not about how can I get you aroused. It's about how can I serve you? How can I create an environment where there's space for breathing, where you can actually take your foot off the brake. The irony of, and I think she talks about this in the book, but the irony of using the metaphor of the accelerator in the brakes is that another big thing is that sex is not a drive. Sex is not something we need for survival, minus maybe like if we talk about procreation, humans will die off if we don't have more babies. But the act of sex itself is not actually necessary for being alive. Food is, water is, all of these things. But that's why the argument that so often gets made, where it's like, I need this. My drive is so high, I need this. Without this, I can't function, is actually unhealthy, because it frames this thing that should be about pleasure and desire as being just about like, well, it's a bodily function, it has to happen. When we say something is a need, then we put it in a different category in our minds. But I think we're also more likely to lean into unhealthy tactics to get it. Like if I need something, I don't care how I have to do it, I'm going to try and get it. Versus if I can acknowledge that it's just something that I want, then there is more openness to being like, yeah, I want that, but maybe this isn't the time, maybe this isn't the space.
Yeah. It just like sparked a lot of conversations I've had with my friends, with partners, with things like that, of that difference of how often people want sex in a relationship. And when that is different, how a lot of our culture, a lot of these ideas or misconceptions come into play, and how it can become a point of contention and frustration, sadness, shame, all sorts of things. And I think, kind of like you're saying, like the need versus the want really makes a difference in how we go about like being with the other person, and engaging with the other person. And even it's kind of interesting to me, like as something becomes more goal oriented, it changes the process of it. So where she talks about like pleasure first, even people who have maybe say like early ejaculation, what is that called?
Premature ejaculation, I think.
Premature ejaculation, there you go. Or things like that. A lot of times when we're focused so much on orgasm, we're putting all this pressure, which hits our brakes. So there are these little tweaks that we can make by knowing more, talking more about this topic, having different language, being able to tell our partner, like, that's hitting my brakes. The way you're trying to go out about getting this is hitting my brakes. Even if I may want it, now I feel like my accelerator's going and my brakes are going. So how do we use this information to improve this in our lives, this area of our lives?
The way that we function sexually is often very connected to our sense of self. And I think particularly in our culture, there's there's a lot of feeling, particularly for guys, like, oh, I need to be really good at this. Like I need to be an expert. And so if I'm doing something and you tell me, oh no, that's not good, like it's really easy to get offended. But if we can shift the narrative to make it about pleasure, it's like, well, every person is different. Every person is different, and therefore you don't learn how to do this for everyone. You learn how to do it for the person that you're with. And what they like might be different than the last person that you were with, than the last person before that, than the last person before that. And there's so much value in, again, centralizing pleasure, because it makes it so that it's not about me being inadequate, which it never was, and it shouldn't be that way, but it is in our minds. It's about me being someone who can provide you pleasure.
And when you talk about it like that, it's like there's a lot more of a conversation that needs to happen, in my opinion, to be like, yeah, is this pleasurable to you? Like, are you enjoying this? Like, it's not just the act in and of itself is enjoyable. Maybe it's not. Like, maybe there needs to be something else over here or a different sensation there. And opening that up, being able to, again, focus it on pleasure, opens that space for more conversation, which I think can be very uncomfortable initially. And I think it deepens a lot of intimacy when you're able to practice that vulnerability or and be interested in caring about what is pleasurable to your partner.
That brings up another thing even, which is that everybody is different. Like over and over again, I want to say that everybody is different and you're normal, and that's okay. That's good. You shouldn't want to be different than you are. Which in and of itself is a shaming statement, so there's that. Welcome to the brain of a therapist, where it's like the words came out and I'm like, don't question whether or not you're normal. I'm going to leave that there. I'm sorry, everybody. Don't shame yourself. But more, the point that I'm driving after, if we cannot get lost in the specific of what I said, is that everyone's going to interact with that in a different way. Like some people are like, ooh, I can figure out what my body likes. Hold on while I disappear for 5 hours with some toys. I'll be back. And some people are like, ooh, no, I don't want to do that. I would rather do that with someone. And sometimes there are people who are like, yes, do more of that or not that. Do this, not that. And other people are like, I don't know. And again, if you can centralize this idea of it's about pleasure, not about performance, then it's like, yeah, if you don't know, that's okay. Like we can explore this. We can have a good time. We can bring pleasure into the experience without all of the judgment or shaming or frustration that come from it being this other like performative thing.
As you were talking about that, I was just thinking about our culture around pleasure or our context of pleasure and in different lights. So say maybe a religious light, is pleasure demonized? Because I've had a lot of people that I've worked with who talk about feeling good about themselves or proud of themselves or things like that through the religious lens that they've learned has been like, no, that's wrong. You shouldn't be proud. You shouldn't feel good about X, Y, or Z. And so I'm curious if that is part of your experience at all, or what else might be going into this like shame or even a conversation about pleasure, how that could be hitting the brakes for some people.
In my experience, and this is interesting because I feel like in my mind, there's the category of sex that we're talking about right now, and then in general life. And I grew up conservative Christian. I don't remember a whole lot of like, you shouldn't be proud of things. Like, in fact, I kind of got the opposite from my parents, where I heard a lot that they loved me. I heard a lot that they were proud of me. I feel like I received a lot of praise for who I was and what I had to offer, which was huge for me, particularly as a dyslexic person. Like that's big. And that's a whole nother conversation there. But I think what is really interesting, because I know that there is in certain, I would say in certain veins of like particularly Christianity, there are absolutely the ideals where it's like, no, you don't, it, you punish your body, like you beat yourself into submission. You can't have anything that could be construed as pride. Like you shouldn't have these things. It's almost like penance, where you're pushing for self-suffering for the sake of some greater purpose. And that does exist, and I think that in and of itself creates a lot of shame and pain, and is really detrimental to people's like sense of self and even ability to accept themselves as they are. Which, just from a Christianity perspective, if you look at like the idea of Christianity and being created in the image of God and how that was supposed to be this incredible thing, it's odd that it gets twisted into this thing where it's like you should be entirely ashamed of the person that you are, when it's like, well, that doesn't align with the idea that you're created in the image of God, even if there's still the sin narrative as part of it. That's a whole different conversation. Hello, I went to seminary. But no, I
Go ahead.
I think the pleasure piece in relation to sex is just totally not talked about. Like I don't remember a single conversation at any point that went further than like, yeah, sex is fun and it feels good.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically in the context of like church, the only conversations I remember about sex is sex outside of marriage is bad, porn is bad, nudity with somebody you're not married to is bad. Like, if you're catching the theme here, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, all bad. But also, the one thing that's good is when you get married, then you can have sex. And it's like, how on earth are we supposed to take that narrative that gets created and overnight just flip a switch and be like, there we go, it's good now, but only in this context?
Yeah.
Like, no, that's illogical to think that narrative would work.
That we'd spend our whole life up until the point where we have sex demonizing it and saying this is bad, not allowed, not okay to feel this human thing that we feel. And then, yeah, flip a switch to be like, awesome, pleasure, let's go. Or even have a conversation about it.
What's crazy is that it doesn't have to be that way. Like if your conviction based on your belief is that you don't want to have sex before marriage, great. Live that, absolutely. Like I respect and value people having conviction that they live by. You don't have to villainize or demonize something simply because you're not engaging in it right now. Or simply because you would not choose to do this doesn't mean you have to be like, well, everybody who does this is bad. And I think there's somewhere in there, we have to find more room for a nuanced narrative. And ideally a narrative that is just more open to being like, hey, this isn't all bad and then becomes good. We have to talk about it as pleasure, as this thing that's like, this is a really good thing. And I think part of why it doesn't get talked about that way is because of fear. Because people are like, well, if we talk about it as a good thing, then how will we convince people that they should not be having it?
Which comes back to like a handful of episodes ago where we were talking about good and bad and that evaluative language. And just the black and whiteness of that. And our mind loves that. It loves it. Like, so how human of us that we do this thing. And it doesn't allow for this context, this space for nuance. But it'd be interesting to even say it's not bad then good. It's neither bad nor good. It is a human thing that happens, that people do, that has consequences sometimes that can be really impactful to your life. That's kind of more how my dad talked about it, which was really, I don't know, I think in general with the context and culture of everything around me, I was still just like, why are we talking about this at all as a kid? But he did more explain it that way and being like, if you get pregnant and have a kid right now, like that will change your life forever. You might see things in different ways after going through this experience, but he was a lot more open, I guess, about it. So I do remember that. And I think that's valuable. Like, let's explain it to people in a way that is like, this is a natural human thing.
Mm-hmm.
And just like everything else you do, choices have outcomes and consequences potentially, or repercussions or things like that. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing.
While you were saying that, I had this thought. And
Okay.
this is anecdotal because it's taking my experience and what I hear in your experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that our parents are all actively teaching us the wrong thing most of the time.
Yes, I agree.
I think most of the time our parents don't know how to talk about it, and so they don't. And then one day, they're like, okay, we need to sit down and have the talk. And what you don't realize is that if something has not been part of the dialogue for the whole time, the talk is not a fun experience. Not pleasant, not comfortable. Like, let's just not do it. Like, let's fast forward through this next 30 minutes. If you want to make this something that you actually are teaching your kids about, you have to have it be part of the conversation. You can't be like, oh, let's just all pretend that storks drop off babies on doorsteps. That's the conversation we're having. It's like, no, we have to talk about our bodies. We have to use actual anatomical names for things. We have to talk about how this works. Because if we don't, and this is the other piece to this, like, our parents aren't failing because they're teaching us the wrong thing. It's just that when we aren't getting regular messaging that's positive, we're receiving what the culture teaches us. And our culture, and media, and porn, and all of these things put together, they're teaching such a distorted, shame-based, judgmental, like, not at all balanced and healthy and pleasure-based perspective.
Yeah.
And yet, I think we also all walk around like, we're like, wow, I'm messed up here. I want somebody to blame. And so we particularly for something like this, we like blame the church or our parents or whoever we can think of. And sure, there's shared responsibility for it being the way it is, but also like, okay, let's talk about how we make it better.
Yeah.
Now that I just talked about why I think it's broken.
A little bit of both. It is this way. We don't have to demonize people, I agree, or religion or culture or things that way. But we can say, like, it is this way, and that's not helpful for most people most of the time. So maybe we do it differently. Like, maybe we open the space to think about it in a different way, to talk about it more or in a different way. When we do that, being able to say, like, this isn't me. It's not internalized anymore, that I am wrong, I'm broken. But then we can lift off some of that shame and choose. There's a little more space to choose what we want it to be. And I think that comes into this next topic of, like, body image and self-esteem, which is very tied into our sexuality and also very influenced by culture. And something that has drastically changed over the centuries, which is neat in a way that it can change. It's not just true or has to be this way. It's flexible and we can choose. So the more we talk about it, the more space we create for these things, I think the more space there is to choose something different. So
much of this ends up getting connected to how we feel about our bodies. And it ends up connecting with this idea of, if I function this way, I'm good, and if I function this way, I'm bad. Or if I look this way, it's good, and if I look that way, it's bad. And we're so bad at looking in the mirror and being like, oh, that's me. Look at that. Look at you. And again, I think that's well, I don't just think this. I know that it's because there are so many messages that we are handed from day one that are like, oh, if you're overweight, you need to be dieting. If you are this, then you need to be doing that. If you want to eat that cookie, you got to go for a run. Like, there are all of these little messages that seep in and then make it so that we feel ashamed about our bodies, or we feel like they need to be different, instead of being able to actually be like, hey, no, this is me. And I can appreciate that. I can explore. I can choose.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking again about shame, and like the physical representation of shame is generally like shoulders up and in, like protecting our important parts. It's very closed off. It's not this sense of like open, interested, communicative, or connected. It's very much the opposite. And all of that messaging that says we are wrong if we're not exactly this, which is wild because even the people who we would put in that category of exactly this that we want, they feel it too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not like you get there and then you feel good about yourself all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
I know our minds say it works that way. It doesn't. I've tried it. If you look around, you'll know this, but I'm just going to put it out there. That's not how it works. So, again, let's try something different.
Mm-hmm.
What if we looked at our bodies for all of the things that they do for us on an everyday basis? Like being able to get out of bed, and if we have full mobility and stuff, being able to stand up and walk around the world, being able to digest all this amazing food or taste this amazing food, being able to see the trees outside or the sun. Like, what if we, again, instead of being like, this is good and this is bad, where we're just using the evaluative terms, what if we more described our experience or had some gratitude over those experiences, recognizing that not all people have full mobility or can see or can hear or can digest things well. So what parts of it do we have that we can be grateful for? Can we just sit in that a little more often? And again, how human of us, because these tendencies to do good and bad in our mind are not our fault. Our mind generally trends towards the negative. That's just something that is, it's been helpful for us at certain points, and it's not so helpful anymore most of the time. So it does take intention to try doing it differently. So again, not a shame-based thing of like, oh, I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm broken because I'm looking at my body this way. It's like, no, it makes a lot of sense that I look at my body this way. And that's not helping me enjoy my body or feel good about myself or feel comfortable in my skin or enjoy pleasure.
What's interesting there is that so often that negative attitude towards self, people talk about it as if they're using it as a motivator.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, I'm fat, so I need to run.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sure, maybe to a point that works. It's kind of there's way more nuance than I'm about to put into this metaphor. But it's kind of like the difference between a really, really processed piece of food and a totally unprocessed, like, fruit or vegetable. Where it's like, they're both energy, they're both fuel, but they will fuel you in a different way.
Love that.
Because when we are giving ourselves that criticism to push ourselves forward, it's like, sure, I am going to push myself. But also, when we are criticizing ourselves, that, in terms of sex, that hits the brakes. But also just in terms of our bodily function, that creates a stress response, which actually inhibits us from having a growth mindset. That inhibits us from being able to actually function as effectively as we could. And it's just like, no, that's not, it doesn't have to be that way. Imagine if you were able to motivate yourself out of love for yourself, out of caring for your body and your functioning, in wanting to nurture yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That there's something there.
Yes.
And also, all of my clients absolutely hate that I go back to that every time we talk about self-criticism.
Yes.
They get very tired of hearing me say it.
It's so comfortable. It's such a well-worn path in our minds, and it feels so natural. And there's a lot of concerns that our minds have about self-love, which also make a lot of sense. Again, if we feel like this is our motivator, this is what helps us do and like continue to try and improve and things like that, which most of us feel that way. It feels really scary to think about letting that go or even trying to do something differently. And I love the metaphor you used. I often use a different one, but more of like, instead of an inner critic, because for me, I know criticism shuts me down. Like as a soccer player, I've had critical coaches that I'm like, I perform worse. I don't feel good. I don't enjoy the sport. I don't have fun. And then I've had encouraging coaches that are like, awesome. I want to try harder. I want to do more.
Mm.
For me, that's what it is internally, with that inner critic, that shaming, low self-esteem kind of feeling. It shuts me down. I do less. I feel worse over time. But that self-love is more of an encouraging coach. It's like, hey, you're trying. I love that. Keep it up. Let's go. This is what you're doing really well. Here's the thing you could try and improve, but you got it.
The language I always push, because I do feel like the concept of self-love, even though I also know I said it, is kind of like it's over. It's been a little bit beaten to death. I love using the idea of self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is I see myself for who I am without judgment. And I accept that all of my strengths, all my weaknesses, my flaws, the things I'm working on, the things I haven't worked on, like I see all of it and I can hold it. And when we can hold that without judgment, it is so much easier to act towards ourselves with care because we're not treating any part of ourselves with disdain. And like that, I think that very quickly moves into self-love because it's like, oh, I can actually care about myself. I can love me for who I am because I can accept me for who I am, which opens up so many doors. But this episode is a door that needs to close because we are also out of time. So
yes, but it's a great place to stop and to just kind of summarize that there are a lot of different things that go into our sexuality, a lot of different things that can hit our accelerator, that can hit our brakes, that sometimes hit one and the other at the same time, things that our body does that our mind doesn't match up with, like we talked about non-concordance. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than just the act.
And as I think we illustrated very well, you don't have to have these conversations perfectly. You don't have to always know the thing to say. You just have to be open to having the conversation and actually try. Stumble your way through it, get through it. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
We're open to questions. We're going to go on to another part to continue this because it's such a big topic. So, yeah, ask any questions you have. We'd love to bring those in.
But otherwise, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, we truly appreciate you. You are in the 1%. And until next time, have a lovely day, night, morning, afternoon, whenever it is for you.